So let's start with an easy one. Do you know what a catapult or a trebuchet is? Something to think about. On the other side of this coin, do you know what a double flounced pagoda is? Or what boning means in regards to supportive undergarments and nothing else? Today, we are starting our multi-part series on research as it applies to fiction, on writing in the tiny house. Hello, and welcome to today's show. Welcome to today's episode of Writing in the Tiny House. I am your host, Devin Davis, and I am the guy in a tiny house who lives in northern Utah and writes stuff and tells you about it. So if you have the system in place, the entire point of this podcast is to show you the tips and tricks that it takes to complete a short story in as few as 3 months, or to complete a novel in as few as 18 months, but hopefully to have the wisdom and foresight to adjust that timeline if you need to. Most projects don't get done in that amount of time, but I want to inspire you guys to write. I want you to get started. I also want all of us to avoid some of these little pitfalls along the way so that things can be easier and things can just be a little bit more efficient. So just a quick announcement before we dive into the bulk of this episode. The announcement is actually two things. I have started again my manuscript for my next short story, Tis. I made some progress with it a few weeks ago and then stopped for entirely personal reasons. And I have chosen to pick it up again, and we are making headway with it. It is so fun. I'm really getting into it, and the story has just been blossoming day after day in my brain, and I am eager to make more progress with this. Along those lines, though, I have chosen to incorporate a second style of episode with this show. So everything is going to have the same intro, the same setup, and so none of that will be different just because I feel it's important to keep the show recognizable. But I have never, in all of this tips and tricks stuff that I've been doing, most of my episodes have been tips and tricks. I have had a few interviews with authors that have been great, but almost all of this is just advice. I have never taken you with me through the process of writing. And so right now I'm working on drafting this short story called Tis, which is installment 2 of Tales from Vlador. And my editor wants it ready for copy edits mid-July. And so that means I get to get this first draft done and then probably 2 rounds of developmental edits and then get it to my editor, Chrissy Barton, with Little Syllables Editing by July 15th. So there is a lot of work to be done. I have found that I am overextended as per usual. I have a lot of projects and a lot of irons in the fire, so to speak. But with this podcast, I have never taken you on a journey with me with writing. And so I have been doing little voice clips as I make progress, just sharing thoughts, sharing concerns, sharing frustrations and hopes for the future, dreads for the future, like the things we dread, all along the way. And I am going to compile those things into 1 or 2 episodes. It depends. The thing is, I'm eager to get started with this type of episode just because it sounds like a fun project, but I know that it is a project that requires a lot more production, and it's actually going to add an expense to the monthly bill to this podcast. And so if you wish to support this podcast, please join my Patreon, patreon.com/writing in the tiny house. Every little bit helps, but I'm eager to do it at least once. We'll see how it goes. I mean, it's the type of episode where it's a ton of editing and a lot of production, background music, all the things. And I will take you with me on the journey to completing this first draft of Tis. And if it's a good experience, I'll take you, periodically on the journey with me through developmental edits and then through the final edits and submission and publication. So expect that in the near future. Today, we are talking about research in regards to fiction. I have done plenty of nonfiction writing when I did my master's program. And so there has been plenty of that as far as experience goes. But at the same time, research and fiction is kind of a different thing. With fiction, especially if you are writing fantasy fiction or science fiction, fiction is not required to cite sources. You don't find footnotes and you don't find a works cited page. Sometimes you could find a glossary of terms, but that's not what this is. With fiction, the one genre of fiction that I have found is usually the most researched and often can include sources is historical fiction. And it's important to pay attention to that, friends. If you are writing historical fiction and you are writing a fictitious viewpoint around a big event and you really want to include specific things about that event, it's important to represent that accurately. Or it's important to share what did happen and what you embellished or what you changed. I think about the movie Inglourious Basterds. And spoiler alert, at the end of that movie, they kill Hitler. That didn't actually happen in World War II. And so it's good just to show that you are taking creative license in the actual events. There is a show called Under the Banner of Heaven. It was also a true crime novel first that deals with some very sensitive things related to the LDS religion and LDS history and the fundamental LDS church and just a lot of things. And we have all found that when it comes to unveiling some of the seedy history of religion, some people can get pretty upset about that just because nobody likes to air that out. But that is very fundamental to the plot of this story and the events that took place under the banner of heaven. It is a historical fiction based on actual events. And so it is a fictionalized interpretation of a murder case that truly did happen in Utah. So with historical fiction, if you are including some of the nitty-gritty details, especially if some of those details are not well known, it is important, or it is courteous, it's a good practice to include resources of some kind. So what some people do, and I have been talking back and forth with my editor, Chrissy Barton, about how this can look. I have read historical fiction novels that do have footnotes. She has read historical fiction books that have author's notes at the ends of sections or at the back of the book or whatever, so that the author is able to simply share what they embellished or what they changed and then include some references. With those references, it's important just to have all of the information be complete. So that's just kind of the basic guideline with that. Like I mentioned earlier, we are diving headfirst into a multi-part series on research as it pertains to fiction. As of right now, it is going to be 3 parts. There is a potential for a 4th part as I continue my correspondence with my editor, just because I want to make sure that all of this is represented. Be sure to tune in next week as we dive into the 2nd part of this mini-series on research in fiction on Writing in the Tiny House. Have a good day, guys. And that is it for today. Just a reminder that Brigitte, installment 1 of Tales from Vlador, is available on Amazon as an ebook and on Audible and Apple Books as an audiobook. And I provide advance reader copies of these short stories as I release them to my patrons. So become a patron today by visiting patreon.com/writinginthetinyhouse to support both my writing and this podcast. And lastly, be sure to follow me on social media. My Instagram is @AuthorDevinDavis, and my Twitter handle is @AuthorDevinD. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today, and have fun writing. We will see you next time. Run by copy editor Chrissy Barton, Little Syllables Editing is a reliable resource for anyone looking to improve their manuscript. Chrissy does line edits, copy edits, and the final proofread for experienced writers and newbies alike. Go to littlesyllables.com and reach out to Chrissy today. A link is in the show notes.